Resuming debate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's good to rise today and speak on Bill C-55, even though our time is going to be limited because of the actions of the Liberal government. But, you know, I've been here, I think, 4 other times trying to get this conversation going, and I will try to get it done today. I rise in the House to speak on Bill C-55, an act that will empower the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans to designate, without consultation, marine protected areas and prohibit activities in those areas for up to 5 years. And after 5 years, the Minister will be able to permanently designate that area as Marine Protected Area, or an MPA. The bill also gives the Governor and Council the authority to prohibit fishing as well as oil and gas activity in MPAs. I must say, Madam Speaker, for a government that constantly praises itself for listening to Canadians and public consultation, I was surprised when I read Bill C-55. I was surprised because the legislation completely ignores any kind of consultation. Now, Madam Chair, I sat on the Environment Committee and was part of the study taking action today establishing protected areas for Canada's future. And I want to make just a comment by one of the witnesses, and that was Paul Croby. I think the most important thing is to do this transparently. What are the economic benefits? What is the baseline management that can be handled over to the communities? Have that up front, right away and across the board, being fair and not negotiating from one space to the next, from one community to the next, or from one land claim to the next. Start at the highest level right off the bat and get to yes very quickly. Now, he's saying that, but he's saying that we need to negotiate. And yet here we have a government that says, we're going to enact this really quick and we'll study it after. Once again, this Liberal government is putting environmental activists ahead of our economy, Madam Speaker, and the local people who these decisions will impact the most will suffer. According to fishermen in Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island and British Columbia, they haven't been consulted about the impacts of Bill C-55 at all. And why should we expect they will be consulted when the Liberals want to turn their regions into protected areas as quickly as possible to reach a personal mandate by that party? The Cape Breton Fish Harvesters Association said they are very upset by this process. It wasn't done the way it should have been done. It should have been done more respectively. The director of Golf of Nova Scotia Planning Board Fishermen's Group said the consultation process was not well planned, organized, or transparent, and even within the Fisheries Department it was disorganized. The chief of the Pictou Landing First Nation said that they have received very little information about the consideration of their region as an MPA, Madam Speaker. She also said to her community depends heavily on the revenues from snow crab and the lobster fishery. And Madam Speaker, that's a $70 million lobster and snow crab fishery that has supported their small coastal region in Cape Breton for many generations, and it could be at risk because of this Bill C-55. I think Mr. Gord MacDonald, a Fort Chew fisherman in Nova Scotia, put it best when he said, it most likely will be damaging than beneficial, but it satisfies a need to be seen as doing good, as being a world leader in protection and conservation. Madam Speaker, some of the locations being proposed aren't in danger. They're being fished in a sustainable manner. That's exactly why our government enforces quotas, etc., to protect these areas. Bill C-55 requires that when deciding to establish an MPA, the minister apply a precautionary approach. When in doubt, add it to the list. Not with any consultation, just add it to the list. First of all, the government consulted, if the government consulted with the people on the ground, they could avoid a lot of uncertainty. Secondly, if the government imposes an MPA that is unnecessary, even for 5 years, the government will destroy the local economy with little gain for marine environment. But as Mr. MacDonald said, the Liberals will look good on the international stage. Madam Speaker, this Liberal government ran a campaign on transparency, yet there are seriously questions about the transparency with the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, both in this legislation and decisions he's made in the past. Let's just go back a few months. The Minister awarded 1/4 of the Arctic surf clam quota to a partnership between Premium Seafoods and the Five Nations Clam Company. However, neither the Liberals nor Five Nations Clam Company would say which Indigenous groups were involved until weeks after the decision was made. Apparently, at the time of the application, not even the applicant knew who was involved, but they got the contract. There were only reserve spots in their proposal for Indigenous groups, and it wasn't until after the quota was awarded that they filled those spots. Smells a little fishy. Not to mention that the president of Premium Seafoods, which won the contract, is the brother of a current Liberal member who has contributed thousands of dollars to the Liberal Party. Sounds fishy. And the president of one of Five Nations partners, also a former Liberal member. The minister needs to stop playing politics with our fisheries and come up with a real plan that will support high-quality, well-paying jobs in our coastal communities. This bill won't only impact commercial fisheries, but it will also hurt people who fish for substance, as well as negative impact on tourism in these areas. For example, when the International Halibut Commission met last year to determine the catch limits of the year for Canada and the U.S., it couldn't come to an agreement and determined best to keep the 27 restrictions in place. When the recreational fishery industry in British Columbia reached its quota early in the year, they had to close for the season just with 36 hours notice from the government. This meant that fishing charters were either out of business for the rest of the year or forced to lease quotas from the commercial fishery. Either way, this cost the fish tourism business a lot of money. What will happen when the government suddenly decides to make a region without consultation a designated area and enforce a 5-year ban on fishing in the area? These companies that rely on sport fishing and tourism will be completely out of business. Forget closing early or having to lease quotas. They won't even be able to leave the docks for 5 years. Where is the compensation for this lost income? I can tell you it's not in this bill, Madam Chair. Mr. MacDonald's family's livelihood depends on the region's bounty of lobster and crab and other species. He calls the proposed MPAs a human exclusion zone. He said they're trying to eliminate humans as if that a form of conservation. True ocean health within the part that humans have control will involve greater human time and investment, not absence. The Liberal plan to protect 10% of marine and coastal areas by 2020 will undoubtedly result in inadequate consultation and large areas from coast to coast to coast being closed to commercial and recreational activities. I am not opposed to the creation of MPAs. In fact, our Conservative Party has championed conservation and marine protected areas in the past. Our previous government focused on building on existing international markets and introducing new ones, while making significant investments in areas like marine research, harbour infrastructure, lobster sustainability, aquaculture, innovation, and Indigenous participation. Now, rather than consulting the communities that will be most impacted, the Liberal government's plan on MPAs, the minister has chosen to fast-track this process in order to meet these self-imposed political targets. There must be a balance between the protection of marine habitat and the protection of local economies that depends on commercial and recreational fishing must be struck. This cannot be achieved without extensive consultation and concerted effort to prioritize the needs of local communities. I challenge the government to answer why it is abandoning consultation and transparency. This bill has the potential to do a lot of damage to local fisheries and is not an example of the economy and the environment going hand in hand, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kells. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The honourable gentleman didn't sit on the Fisheries Committee, so there may be a few points of enlightenment, not the least of which is that most of the activities going on in area designated as an interim marine protected area would be allowed to continue to go on. So, in fact, the people who fish, make a living in that area would not be deprived. They talk about consultation, and we saw a glaring example of the lack of a consultation, not by the previous government, but by a government many steps down the line on July 2nd, 1992, when John Crosbie closed the cod fishery. Why did he do that without consultation? Because it had collapsed, because steps hadn't been taken in advance to prevent that kind of collapse. So I would ask the honourable gentleman, is it better to come in at least with an interim safety measure using the precautionary principle and avoid what John Crosbie had to do in 1992?
The honourable member for Yellowhead.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I believe what the Liberal government is attempting to accomplish is a follow-up of the taking action today, establishing protected areas in Canada's future. This is a report done by the Environment Committee and Sustainable Development. And if you look in there, and I can go right to this page over here, Madam Chair, CPAWS appeared before the committee and talked about putting 50% of Canada's landmass in protected spaces and wanted to increase the coastal protected areas. And if you look on a chart in here, Madam Chair, it pretty well surrounds all of our coastal waters. And I believe what we're seeing here is a government who is reacting to trying to make a 10% limit within the next year, as they promised to the public, and they are not doing it with proper and respectful consultation. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I got up a little bit earlier and asked a previous speaker a question, but we did have a project in my area when our government was in power. It was to do with leasing pasture land, and Environment Canada was very cooperative with us. The deputy minister came out. Chief of Staff came out and sat down with the local community. There was a local community group that was set up in order to handle this. The government had left the impression that they would be directing research funding through that area, kind of a pilot project, and the local people would have a lot of say over how that money might be distributed, the research that might be done, and they gave credit to the local people for having knowledge about how to manage that area. That's changed. Now we see a situation where the local people are threatened, where they're intimidated, where they're condescended to, and the attitude seems to be that Environment Canada knows most everything. And I don't know that attitude came from the Environment Canada people themselves as much as it did from this government. So as this member's talking about this legislation, tell us a little bit about whether you think this is going to make it easier for local communities to work with the government and with Environment Canada, or make it much more difficult. We did have a good relationship in my part of the world. That seems to have gone out the window, and I wonder what he sees happening along the fisheries notions with this bill.
The honourable member for Yellowhead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank the honourable member for that question from Grasslands. You know, without proper consultation, working with the Indigenous people of the area, with the local ranchers and dealing with agricultural leases for rangeland and stuff like that, it has to be done. We need to work with the local ranchers. We need to work with the local counties, with the local Indigenous groups, and plan ahead. What was said, and I'm going to refer back to my favorite report here because I sat on that committee, Madam Chair, is taking action today and establishing protected areas for Canada's future. You know, we'd have the environmental groups come in and tell us that they wanted to protect all this land. And then we'd have the environment, not the environment, but the natives from northern Canada, from the Northwest Terriers, the Inuit, come in and say, whoa, whoa, slow down. We want to be involved in the consultation. We want to talk about what's best for the land that we live on. We want to know how we're going to protect the economy for our future, but also protect the environment. And I think that's what it's about. And this is fast-tracking it. Bill C-55 is fast-tracking, putting these protected areas in immediately, and then do the consulting after or the negotiating after.